10 minutes before she was meant to walk down the aisle, a uniformed officer snapped metal cuffs around the wrists of the bride standing under the wedding tent. The gown was a $15,000 dress. The guest list included judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and roughly 200 friends and family. The bride was not an ordinary guest. She was Jasmine Williams, the district attorney of Charleston County, a prosecutor who had spent 8 years sending officers and others to prison for abusing power. What happened next would force a reckoning that stretched from a ruined wedding day to a federal courtroom and a multi-million-dollar verdict. The scene at Magnolia Gardens estate on that afternoon is almost cinematic in its cruelty. White tents, floral arrangements, a string quartet meant to play the processional, and then the sudden, surreal image of a woman in a wedding dress in handcuffs. It is the kind of moment that arrests attention because it inverts expectations. The person whose job is to hold the state to account became, in an instant, the subject of state force. What followed, the investigation, the trial, the verdict, and the institutional fallout, reads like a case study in how individual misconduct can expose systemic failures. Jasmine Williams's professional arc helps explain both the shock of the arrest and the national attention it drew. A graduate of Howard University School of Law, she finished near the top of her class and rose quickly through the local legal ranks. At 32, she became the youngest district attorney in the county's history. Colleagues and records showed an ambitious prosecutor with an aggressive record. In 8 years, she secured convictions in a very high proportion of felony cases, and she was known for holding law enforcement accountable when officers crossed legal lines. Jasmine was a single mother and the first lawyer in her family. The wedding was not only a personal milestone, but a public affirmation of stability after years of hard work and public service. That made the sudden humiliation of being arrested in front of her mother, her friends, and career peers feel especially sharp, not simply because a ceremony was interrupted, but because it violated the values she had dedicated her career to defending. Standing opposite that image is Derek Matthews, a 14-year veteran of the Charleston Police Department. His personnel file showed repeated complaints from community members and colleagues over the years. The pattern of incidents, a confrontational traffic stop in 2019, an aggressive parking dispute in 2021, an encounter with an elderly gardener in 2022, and an altercation at a neighborhood block party in 2023, painted a trajectory of escalating confrontations. In each case, those who filed complaints alleged similar themes: unnecessary force, demeaning language, and an inclination to escalate otherwise routine situations. Internal Affairs, however, repeatedly declined to sustain many of those complaints. For people who followed misconduct cases in Charleston, the dismissals were a red flag about internal accountability. As one element of the later investigation would reveal, Matthews' file, when placed alongside other complaint histories, was part of a broader pattern that internal oversight mechanisms had failed to correct. On the day of the wedding, the timeline is precise. At 3:15 p.m., under an overcast sky that kept the light soft instead of glaring, the rehearsal chorus struck up the last notes of a song. The venue, Magnolia Gardens Estate, had a permit for amplified sound that extended until 10:15 p.m. The event coordinator, Sarah Chen, had the signed paperwork on hand and was prepared to show it to any municipal authority. Judges in formal robes, including Circuit Court Judge Patricia Monroe, were in attendance. The Deputy Police Chief, Thomas Rivera, was also present as a guest. Many attendees were legal professionals who had spent careers in courtrooms. Their presence would later turn the wedding tent into a locus of testimonial power. The first inkling of trouble arrived as Derek Matthews approached the tent. According to multiple witnesses and the later recorded footage, Matthews entered the tent without a formal announcement, without seeking verification, and without coordinating with the event staff. He confronted the band and the event coordinator, demanding that the music stop. One of the clearest audio clips from a phone camera captures him saying, "I don't care what papers you got. Music stops now." Jasmine, still in her veil, stepped forward and responded with a line that would replay across news segments. "Officer, I'm the bride. This is my wedding. That exchange, brief and raw, is preserved on multiple devices. What happened in the next minutes elevated the encounter from an overzealous enforcement to a use of official power that, according to investigators and later prosecutors, lacked lawful basis. The officer moved to grab Jasmine's arm. An altercation followed. Guests pulled out their phones and began recording. Several witnesses described Jasmine trying to explain the permit and the presence of judiciary members. They described her attempting to de-escalate and asking for time to show documentation. Matthews, according to the surveillance footage and 6 separate phone angles recorded that afternoon, proceeded to forcefully handcuff Jasmine. The cuffs left visible red marks and tore portions of the train on the $15,000 gown. Bridesmaids and family members crowded around, crying out for him to stop. Judge Monroe rose from her seat, and in a voice that many later described as both authoritative and incredulous, demanded to know why the arrest was taking place. Deputy Chief Rivera, also present, stepped in almost immediately to take control of the situation on the department's behalf. The officer was ordered to uncuff Jasmine. Eventually, under the scrutiny of multiple witnesses, and with his actions captured from nearly every angle in the tent, Matthews complied and was escorted away. Within minutes, the incident had migrated from a private catastrophe to a public record. Friends uploaded clips to social media. By evening, local news picked up the footage. Within days, the videos had racked up millions of views, sparking national conversation about policing, power, and accountability. For internal affairs and federal civil rights investigators, the presence of so many recordings removed the kind of ambiguity that often shelters disputed encounters. Investigators had access to at least 6 phone videos taken from different angles, as well as the venue's surveillance camera. Those multiple perspectives made it possible to align timelines, audio, and behavior with a high degree of clarity. The permit Sarah Chen had produced was valid until 10:40 p.m. Independent noise readings taken that day also showed that the event was operating within permitted levels. These pieces of evidence, permits, noise measurements, and multiple video feeds, undermined the claim that the action was justified by a legitimate public safety need. Within 24 hours, Internal Affairs had opened a formal investigation, and federal civil rights authorities signaled their interest. The case that would be assembled combined clear video evidence, witness testimony from attendees including judges and fellow prosecutors, documentation of the event's permits, and Matthews' own statements. The investigators cataloged a series of potential violations: false imprisonment, for the restraint of Jasmine without lawful basis, official misconduct, for abusing the trappings of authority, and civil rights violations, for depriving someone of a constitutionally protected liberty through improper use of power. Those are technical labels with public meaning. False imprisonment describes restraint without lawful justification, while civil rights violations invoke federal protections that guard against government actors depriving citizens of rights secured by the Constitution. The charge list that eventually reached the federal docket mirrored these lines. The indictment detailed both the actions at Magnolia Gardens and the context in Matthews' personnel file. Prosecutors presented the case to a grand jury, which returned an indictment on multiple counts. The trial that followed in federal court was notable for the candor and weight of its audio-visual record. Jurors were shown the 6 phone videos side by side with the venue camera footage, calibrated to the same timestamps so that small movements and phrases could be seen and heard simultaneously. Experts testified about proper police procedure in handling noise complaints and private events, and about the absence of exigent circumstances that might justify an immediate arrest. Witnesses, including Jasmine, Judge Monroe, Deputy Chief Rivera, and several bridesmaids, gave emotional and factual testimony about what they saw and felt in the tent that afternoon. The prosecution emphasized the disparity between the minimal disruption alleged by the officer's initial complaint and the force actually chosen to end the encounter. Defense counsel sought to frame Matthews' actions as a misguided but reasonable attempt to enforce the law in a tense moment, highlighting that officers sometimes must make split-second decisions. Yet when confronted with synchronized video, The jury found that Matthews's decision to enter the tent, without confirming authority, to ignore visible permits, and to escalate to handcuffs without a lawful basis rose to the level of criminal conduct. The jury returned a conviction on the principal counts, and Matthews was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Alongside the criminal verdict, the court issued a prohibition against Matthews returning to law enforcement duties, a lifetime ban from policing as part of the sentencing and administrative aftermath. The criminal case, however, was only one thread of a larger fabric of accountability. Jasmine filed a civil lawsuit alleging deprivation of civil rights, false arrest, and emotional harm. That civil case proceeded to trial as a separate matter, where the standard of proof differs, but the evidentiary record was essentially the same. Multiple angles of video, permit documentation, noise readings, and witness testimony attesting to the humiliation and physical harm, torn dress, bruising, and the psychological injury of being publicly handcuffed. The civil jury returned a verdict awarding Jasmine $21.9 million in damages. The dollar figure reflected not only tangible losses, but also a recognition of emotional pain, reputational harm, and the broader affront to civil liberties. The local and federal investigations did not stop with the two trials. The footage and the circumstances of the arrest prompted a department-wide audit. Investigators reviewed personnel files across units and found an alarming pattern. Matthews was not an isolated case. In the review that followed, investigators identified 17 officers with complaint histories showing similar patterns of escalation and repeated civilian grievances. Many of those complaints had been dismissed or inadequately investigated by the department's old internal affairs processes. The audit concluded that the internal system had structural weaknesses, overlapping chains of command, lack of civilian oversight, inadequate documentation, and a culture that tended to close ranks rather than launch thorough inquiries. The institutional fallout was swift. 17 officers were fired or forced out as the audit's findings became public, and a federal monitor moved to place the department under oversight. Internal affairs was overhauled. Civilian leadership and external oversight mechanisms were inserted to ensure that future complaints would receive neutral review. The department agreed to reforms in training, use of force policy, complaint intake, and transparency measures. Federal oversight, a form of court or monitor-supervised reform, ensured that the department would be subject to external accountability in the months and years to come. Beyond the personnel changes and the legal outcomes, the human consequences of that afternoon resonated. Jasmine and Marcus Thompson, the groom, chose to reclaim their ceremony in privacy. 6 months after the incident, they married in a private service away from media attention and public audiences. Jasmine's public comments afterward were a mix of personal sorrow and civic admonition. In press conferences, she described the deep humiliation of being restrained in her wedding dress and the way the moment exposed a system that protects its own, rather than the people it serves. She used her platform to make a point about inequality, that her ability to pursue justice, to secure the conviction of Derek Matthews and the $21.9 million civil award, was aided by her credentials, connections, and resources. She warned that ordinary citizens often lack those advantages, and therefore must rely on robust oversight systems and careful documentation to seek redress. Throughout the aftermath, documentation emerged as a central theme. The case is demonstrative of how modern accountability often hinges on video, multiple eyewitness accounts, and careful preservation of physical evidence. In this instance, 6 phone cameras and venue footage formed a kind of forensic chorus that corroborated permits and noise measurements. The presence of judges and a deputy chief as eyewitnesses added public legitimacy to the immediate accounts. Jasmine herself urged people to document encounters and to seek independent witnesses when they have concerns. That advice, while practical, underscored a painful reality she highlighted in interviews. The law is not always enough if the institutions charged with enforcing it are not structured to police themselves. The larger civic questions this story raises go well beyond one officer and one wedding. The audit's discovery, that dozens of similar complaints were dismissed or inadequately investigated suggests that when internal systems fail, abuses can accumulate. Civil rights lawyers and reform advocates pointed to the case as an argument for mandatory civilian oversight, transparent complaint processes, and external auditing of police departments. Reformers recommended changes in training, disciplinary procedures, and public reporting standards. Critics of these proposals argued for caution, saying that not every complaint reflects misconduct and that reforms must preserve officers' ability to protect public safety. The case of Jasmine Williams, however, complicates those critiques. When the stakes are high and the evidence clear, the system's failure is not an abstract harm, but a concrete violation of a person's liberty and dignity. In processing what happened, it helps to separate three things: the immediate facts at the scene, the findings of investigators and prosecutors, and the broader institutional reforms that followed. At the scene, the facts were dramatic and well documented. An officer entered a wedding tent, ordered the music stopped, told attendees to cease, and then handcuffed the bride despite a valid permit and the presence of numerous legal professionals. Investigators established through synchronized video and permit records that the event was authorized to continue through the night, and that noise levels were within permitted ranges. Prosecutors then used that evidentiary record to prove criminal conduct beyond a reasonable doubt, leading to Matthews's conviction and 8-year sentence. In civil court, jurors weighed the same evidence under a preponderance standard and awarded Jasmine $21.9 million. Finally, the audit of department practices and personnel led to firings, forced departures, and a federal oversight mechanism intended to repair an accountability system that had failed many complainants over time. The cost of these events is both personal and systemic. For Jasmine, the day was a wound that could not be fully healed by verdicts or damages. She lost the public wedding she and her family had planned, the dress was torn, and the memory of being restrained in front of loved ones remains. For the public, the case exposed the price of inadequate oversight. When complaints are dismissed at a high rate and internal processes fail to correct problematic patterns, citizens face increased risk of harm. The civil verdict and the criminal sentence sent a legal message that abuse of power has serious consequences. But the broader lesson, one that advocates and reformers seized upon, was that meaningful accountability requires structures, not just penal outcomes for a single officer. There are practical takeaways for individuals and civic institutions alike. For citizens, Jasmine's advice about documentation is straightforward. When confronted by an officer, if it is safe to do so, record the encounter. Get the names and badge numbers of officers involved. Secure witnesses and preserve any available footage. For communities and policymakers, the case points to the necessity of independent oversight. Civilian review boards with real investigatory power, transparent reporting of complaint outcomes, and external audits that can detect and correct troubling patterns before they escalate. For police departments, the Magnolia Gardens incident is a reminder that trust is fragile and that internal cultures that shield misconduct ultimately erode public confidence. None of this should be read as a wholesale condemnation of law enforcement as an institution. Many officers serve with honor and risk their lives daily to protect their communities. The core point here is narrower, but no less urgent. When individual misconduct occurs and internal safeguards fail, the consequences can be severe for victims and for public trust. The reforms that followed, the firing of 17 officers or the forced departures identified in the audit, the reconstruction of internal affairs under civilian leadership, and the imposition of federal oversight, were designed to address those systemic shortcomings while preserving the capacity of policing to serve public safety. The final legal record in this case is stark. Derek Matthews was criminally convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison for his actions at the wedding. A civil jury awarded Jasmine $21.9 million. The department accepted the findings of an audit that identified a broader pattern of problematic conduct. As a result, many officers were removed, and the department agreed to significant reforms under federal supervision. These outcomes are facts, The verdicts, sentence, and reforms were the tangible consequences that followed from the evidence captured that day, and the investigations that followed. Yet the emotional aftermath resists tidy closure. Jasmine's public remarks after the trials mixed gratitude for accountability with a sober warning. Her ability to pursue justice was aided by her position, resources, and public platform. For everyday citizens without those advantages, seeking redress can be much more difficult. That point underscores why the reforms matter beyond one dramatic headline. Civilian oversight, accessible complaint mechanisms, and transparency help ensure that ordinary people can have their grievances heard and investigated, even when they lack influence or visibility. What started as a wedding day catastrophe became, in effect, a catalyst. It brought national attention to the problem of officer misconduct, provided an unusually clear record of wrongdoing, and forced institutional change. The images that circulated, the torn dress, the handcuffs gleaming against white fabric, the stunned faces of judges and guests, made abstract debates about oversight immediate and visceral. For a profession that depends in part on public consent, moments like these erode legitimacy. When the public sees abuse go unpunished, trust frays. When the system responds with transparency and reform, however, there is an opportunity to restore confidence. There are uncomfortable tensions embedded in this story. Accountability requires both the will and the tools to act. Criminal prosecution demands a high standard of proof. Civil damages acknowledge harm in a different register. Structural reform requires political courage and resources. None of these steps are quick or easy. But the sequence in Charleston, swift media exposure, thorough evidence collection, criminal prosecution, civil litigation, an audit revealing systemic patterns, and then administrative reform under federal oversight, provides a blueprint for how a community can respond when a single act of misconduct reveals deeper problems. In the end, the headline is accurate and shocking in equal measure. Police officers arrested a bride on her wedding day, and she was the district attorney. But the tragedy is more than the inversion of roles. It is the lived humiliation of a woman in her dress, the legal and emotional harm inflicted in front of friends and family, and the revelation of a system that had too often closed ranks in the face of repeated complaint. The legal outcomes: Matthew's conviction and 8-year sentence, the $21.9 million civil award, the firing or forced departure of 17 officers, and federal oversight of the department, are the concrete responses that followed. They do not erase the harm, but they do provide an example of the law working to address abuse. As viewers, citizens, and participants in civic life, there are productive steps to take that stay within the law and strengthen democratic accountability. Support for independent civilian oversight, insistence on transparent complaint processes, and public pressure for audits when patterns emerge are all civic tools that do not demand vigilantism or partisanship. Documentation, the simple step of recording and preserving evidence when safe to do so, can be vital. And holding public officials and institutions to standards of transparency and fairness is a collective responsibility. Have you ever been treated unfairly by someone in power? Tell us below. Your experiences are part of a larger conversation about how communities can demand better and build systems that protect everyone. The case of Jasmine Williams and the events at Magnolia Gardens changed one woman's wedding day into a national conversation about power, proof, and accountability. It demonstrated how modern evidence, multiple phone cameras, venue footage, permits, and noise readings can pierce through conflicting narratives. It showed how a determined prosecution and civil action can produce consequences for abuse of power. And it revealed the urgent need for institutional structures that detect and correct patterns of misconduct before a single act becomes a public tragedy. If this story moved you, share the video to raise awareness. Check the verified resources in the description for organizations and petitions focused on civilian oversight and police accountability. And, if you can, support efforts that promote transparency and independent review in policing. The work of reform is civic and sustained. The case at Magnolia Gardens is a reminder of why that work matters.